Okay, so I experienced the Odophonics performance at the Scent Art Festival in Riga now this May 26th, and it was an intriguing experience. I was not familiar with the PS's theory of the scent scales or whatever, and then this was an interesting experience for me to get to know that together with the musical performance. Could you tell a bit about that?
Sure. I was unfamiliar with it when I came across it in 2014. And what's interesting is here you have this chemist and perfumer from the middle of the 19th century who publishes a, a treatise essentially on perfumery, and mixed in is this thing that he called an odophone. And the odophone, as you mentioned, literally it's just a scale of musical notes that have attached to each note a corresponding scent. And at the time, I thought it was kind of interesting because maybe 10 years before that, we saw Buck and Axel receive the Nobel Prize for their understanding mechanisms that contributed to how we smell. And that completely debunked what PS was talking about, himself a chemist. And I like that as a starting point because I was thinking that his time during his time, he thought that smell operated in the same way that sight and sound operated on, which is to say waves. And so using that musical metaphor to create an attachment between scent and sound must have made sense. When I started this project, I started working with a composer and musician named Sean Francis Conway, and I told him how strange this was, and he started playing these notes, and he'd play major chords, minor chords, seventh, and all these chords that either resolved or didn't, and I would create the accord using the musical notes that PS had specified, and it was really amazing that there was an equivalency between these two in a way that wasn't accidental. Let's say that there seemed to be an overarching logic, and so that was enough for Sean and I to kind of pursue this project. And that was 2014 was the first 2015 was the first time we premiered this with a chamber quartet, and then 2016 we did it again, and we finished off our collaboration in 2023 with a project with a performance of Odophonics in Los Angeles. And then that's when I thought that, wow, why don't I open this project up to other composers whose vision might extend the parameters. And I know that Preston was interested in working with choirs. And so maybe I could ask you, Preston, what about working with choirs and the voice resonated with the premise of Odophonics?
Yeah, I think as soon as you mentioned possibly getting a choir involved and working with me on this, the first thing that hit me was that it was perfect for scent because voices are air. They move into the air just like scent does in a certain way. They have an airiness, and they can create a choir, especially many voices can create a sort of fog of sound in a room that can hang there. I like to use acoustics of physical spaces a lot in my compositions, and always think about resonance and overtones, which is something voices can really play with in really interesting and affecting ways to a live audience. And because scent can only be experienced live at this point anyway, very well, I found the idea of having a live choir with the scent just seemed like such a good confluence in terms of the way that they move through a room. So that was kind of my first thought.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It is appropriate to note that although PS's theory about scent and smell is by now a scent and sound is by now kind of an anachronism, the perfume industry still today uses the musical metaphors that he generated, notes, accords, rhythm, progression, texture, as ways of describing how scent operates in kind of an aesthetic space.
Yeah, super interesting.
Erik, as someone who was in the audience, but with a very similar set of background skills in terms of using scent and music in performative events. What was your take on experiencing that project?
Well, my take on the cross modality between, for instance, between smelling and hearing has been oriented towards cross-modal correspondences, for instance, from psychology, or basically the intuitive reaction that you get. So I could sort of present the smell to a musician, or I could try to improvise musically a scent, or maybe we could go the other way and we hear some music or hear some sounds and then associate and work associatively between the scent and sound, which is quite different to my understanding that compared to the PS way of thinking. Although I don't know if he started also creating these intuitive links or if he did it otherwise. Now these seem to be sort of fundamental statements about what is matched, right? So working on the intuitive scale and the cross-modal scale, the personal plays a big role, whereas working according to some sort of recipe uh, is in a way it depersonalizes the link between scent and sound, which is interesting, and that was new to me. So it makes something that is maybe personal, idiosyncratic, individual into something generalized, which is then, as you say, maybe academically debunked, but still it might provide some inspiration or uh, be sort of a seed that could grow into something else. The same way as we use fictional literature to become wiser human beings. It's fiction, but still it gives something to us that we find valuable. So there were two things I was wondering. The first, we have now talked about the concept itself, whether it is true or not, whether it works or not. But the second question is the concept as enacted in performance, which to me is two different things, because then suddenly there are a lot of choices that come into play, right? Are you playing the chord as a chord or as an slow arpeggio in terms of the sense, the rate of distribution and perception is very different between sound and scent, or between hearing and smelling, and so forth. So that these are interesting questions for me, and to me maybe it's not so important to say, oh, that really fit well together, or I didn't, or sometimes maybe I don't find any correspondence between what I'm smelling and what I'm hearing. But maybe those questions, or those, that is not necessarily the most interesting track to follow, looking for those
Mm-hmm.
matchings, rather than exploring what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
So to suspend the judgment of the thumbs up, thumbs down, and just asking what's going on, rather than passing that judgment.
Right.
Yeah, I think I can say for me, there is a tension between the formal exercise, which is something maybe you're talking about, this idea that we're working within a restraint, which is PS's system. It's not just anything goes. It's not just what sounds good or what I happen to like. I have to sit here with this scale that Brian has provided me with that covers 4 or 5 octaves, that has precise sense for each note. And it is a quite restrained system. It's only natural notes. There's no black keys, for instance, in PS's system. I'm not sure why. But at first, that's kind of a drag for a composer, because you've just taken out all my black keys, But at the same time, I really started to enjoy that. And as a challenge in terms of like, okay, great, here's what we're working with. I'm going to stay within it. And how can I still make it something that has some kind of substance, some kind of, Xenakis called it hard yoke, some kind of rigor, but that still engages in a way with the scent that remembers there's going to be an audience and we are creating a performance. So the tension for me is working within a restraint, and like you said, not only being concerned with the thumbs up or thumbs down. Maybe that's not the only interesting thing, but I would push back and still say that is important, because when we look at things like serialism in music, for instance, there was a very rigid restraint about using all the notes, and Schoenberg and his acolytes continued that. And I think it's really valuable, but at the same time, the trap that it fell into was getting so caught up in not worrying about judgment and following the rule that a lot of it became quite unlistenable. And so I think that was where I tried to walk the line as an artist and composer, not losing sight of the human element and the beauty of music and scent, and not being afraid of that or thinking that I have to be super restrained and formal even about that, while still not drifting into just being sentimental. So I think we succeeded. I felt like this piece stuck to the project, but still created a very shimmering, moving experience, at least from the feedback I've gotten from the audience.
Interesting point, because from my side of things, I absolutely appreciate that observation, Erik, that by focusing just on PS's scale, it removes a lot of the expressive capability from my hands. And that's always for me like the best place for me to operate. My entire career has been about limiting the expressive potential of myself in order to maximize a certain set of well, what Preston referred to with Xenakis and the hard yoke, but a set of kind of like rigor, getting the most out of what I'm working with. And so what I thought was interesting when Preston brought over the original score for this, and it was in 4 movements, and he was kind of telling me about what he felt each movement was about. And I'm looking at the 5 notes that I'm limited to per movement and thinking, okay, well, how can I best express this? Because on the one hand, a novice might say, okay, well, you have to be rigorous about it. It has to be full concentration of each of these at the same time. When in fact, like from just a health and safety issue, that would be a one and done performance, right? Like we would wind up in prison. But what I was thinking was that, okay, so for instance, in the 4th movement, there is the note that corresponds to civet. And civet is an animalic scent. It smells, frankly, like ass, and it's useful in balancing things out that might be floral, might be a little too sweet. And so, what I was able to do creatively was start to think about, okay, well, not even just the frequency with which I transmit or disseminate scent into the audience, but what's the concentration of each scent that goes out, and how long will it linger before it essentially evaporates, and I would either have to renew it, or I could try to time the evaporation with a rest, several measures of rest, which in some sense, in some cases, were in Preston's composition. And so in that way, it felt very much like a creative experience, and one in which I had to know the space during rehearsal well enough to know what the audience might be sensing because when you're in my position behind the hot plate, which is creating steam and transmitting it through fans into the audience, it's almost like a singer singing to a crowd, but without having that studio monitor giving him or her that impression of what it is that's actually going out. So yeah, in some cases, I would be flying blind had it not been for quite a bit of rehearsal.
Yes, and this working with music, you're working with acoustics, and you can get a pretty quick response walking around the room, checking how does this choir sound here, 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 and if you're looking at, well, if we translate to Odophonics or something like that, right?
That's right.
You said, Brian, that the scent subsides, but that's from where you're standing, right? So whereas the conductor can monitor at any time, for instance, the volume of the music. You as a aroma jockey, you cannot monitor that unless you run back and forth through the room, and even then you don't know it because you get adapted to the scent. So you might actually not be able to smell the intensity of the scent other places in the room, and the audience, through their adaptation of that scent, because you cannot smell your own body odor so easily and so forth, you get the lower sensitivity, and then for a person coming in midway into the concert, it could be very different to those who have been sitting there for some time. So the complexity is really great, and of course that opens for a lot of exciting experimentation.
It does strike me, Preston, that you had had done two things to kind of allow that adaptation to maybe pass. One had to do with the start of the performance, where as opposed to on the one, like the choir breaks into a note, you actually have them doing kind of like a buzzing sound, which I thought was interesting because it almost mimics the sound of the fan when I turn it on, and that's when I know that the piece has started, is when, or the audience knows that the piece has started, is when I turn the fan on, and it corresponds to that sound that the choir is making. But then, could you talk a little bit about why you chose to end and begin successive movements in the way that you did, and maybe how that relates to what Erik talks about regarding adaptation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I could take credit for anticipating the sound of the fan, and that I'm just a genius for matching the sound. But that was a happy accident. But I do think that the way I start the piece, because we're about to enter this kind of journey of these movements with scent, there is so much. There is so much motion between notes in the piece over an extended period that I liked the idea of, like, anytime you start a journey, there's kind of like a preamble or an opening, and just thinking in terms of the performance, it's kind of a preparatory or a prologue to have these kind of insect sounds, which is kind of an ode to the season in the Baltics and all of that. And then also have your presence kind of become situated. I think sometimes if we jump right into it, it's almost hard for the ears, the nose, and the mind to catch up. So that was part of the opening. The closings were quite different because I had to start thinking about that I've composed for scent in this piece, not just sound. And that each movement does end up having its own fragrance, which is 5 scents, corresponding to the 5 voices I wrote for in the choir: 2 sopranos, alto, tenor, and bass. And when they have a main note in a chord that kind of modulates and mutates throughout each movement, but there is a root chord. And so I started thinking about allowing space for scent to build and decay, especially as we go into the next movement. So in my own mind, because this was a new experience for me, I thought that rushing or jumping right from scent to scent without any rest sounded too saturated in my mind. And I think it bore out that way. I think having certain voices rest or certain sections subtract also does that with the fragrances. So it seemed that there was never a moment, at least from where I was observing the performance, that these scents were getting too mixed together or were overwhelming or just became a soup, which is what I was kind of worried about. And that instead each movement did maintain its integrity, and you could feel this slow wafting of scent, if that makes sense.
Which is kind of an interesting idea related to something that Erik, when you and I met, we shared different takes on the kind of technical apparatus by which you can transmit sense into an audience, and there's yet third or fourth takes based on when we were at the Scent Festival, what other people registered as being potentially novel devices to transmit scent. When I do it, I will use liquid filled bowls on hot plates that are creating steam, and then I will essentially embed the oils, which are in a it's probably going too deep down a rabbit hole, but it's in a fractionated coconut oil base, so that it evaporates slower, because I want that steam to kind of heat up the molecules, to kind of allow them to linger, kind of like how smells in a damp, kind of in a warm environment seem to be like the most persistent. Whereas when I witnessed your performance with Andreas, you were doing things that were much more like focused and staccato shots. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your approach and why you use that.
Well, the why question is basically so simple that this is what I could come up with from my imagination. Although I have seen aroma jockeys having pots and pans steaming and bubbling and behind the fans. But since I came into this from the cross-modal correspondence kind of thinking, we wanted to be able to sort of distribute a certain scent for a certain period of time, and we wanted. I'm a percussionist, maybe that comes from it. That I wanted it to be sort of a clear start rather than growing slowly. I wanted it to sort of, okay, here it comes. So that's how I came up with making either an emulsion, whether it's soluble in ethanol or a solution, a dilute solution, and then I just evaporate it so it goes up into the air and it's pulled through the fans. We could of course use a spray bottle, which would give a slightly different effect also. So it's maybe closer to the spray bottle than what you're doing, Brian. And I think these are basically different instruments. I think it's not a matter of which to prefer. It's basically saying, do you prefer violin or trumpet or cello? They just play different. They play the sense differently, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when to use it.
And I would say that the scents come out differently also using the different methods. Not only the rate, but also which parts of the scents that come out and are highlighted, which is interesting. And again, another area of the research if you want to do that.
Additionally, there's that relationship to improvisation.
Yeah.
Whereas Erik, performance I experienced of yours, it was much more improvisatory than mine and Preston's, which I think, I don't know, Preston, if you would agree, but it feels to me as though ours is quite choreographed.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I wrote a score, and that was something I was going to bring up. The sense of time in our piece was very prominent because Brian is essentially another musician in this performance. He has to follow the score and watch the conductor, and I have certain scents scored at certain measures within movements. So there was more of a choreography in terms of scoring a piece for scent along with the choir in a musical way. That was my thought. And so, I mean, I thought Brian did an amazing job at it. But also, that's true. We just chose, like you said, there are different routes. Improvisation can be super interesting. But I found this project of ours really challenging and edifying to see how we could work with scent like an instrument, like a musical note, in a very literal way, in terms of like the scent comes in measure 5 when the conductor gives the cue. So that was very cool to me. I don't know if you found that stressful or you enjoyed it, Brian.
Well, once I understood how the conductor was visualizing your, I guess you wouldn't even call it time signature.
Yeah, well, you have to break up. It was a proportional score, so it used a timer instead of keeping a tempo because I didn't write a rhythmic piece. I wrote a very sonic piece using sustained notes and duration. So both of us needed to understand when we arrived in Riga and we did our dress rehearsal, how the conductor was choosing to cue the beginning and end of each measure. And he's a very talented young up and coming composer. And I thought he did a fantastic job.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
It was like really interesting to see the idiosyncratic way he solved that problem because
it
again we were
was.
working with a youth choir, so I think maybe the conductor was the oldest person there, like 21, 22 years old, but so professional. And these Latvian singers were just took themselves so seriously, still young people, and it was fun to see during the rehearsal, how they were taking the feedback, how they experienced things when they were able to kind of like step out of themselves as performers and experience the whole, and just the surprise of, if I'm using the musical term right, the overtones that were created.
Yes.
Just sonically, it was astonishing. The shimmering that it gave, kind of like the aural equivalent of what I imagine these molecules were doing in that mist that's kind of floating around the room.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it was everything I had hoped for, but you never know until you're in the room and you hear the voices. So I was so glad, so pleased that the overtones really were quite striking, and I agree they did mirror somewhat the experience maybe of how the scent's moving through the room. It was great.
I have a question for you, Brian, or both of you. You were talking about the scent of a civet, Brian, which is not necessarily pleasant. So in music, we have become used to music that is not always tickling your ear, right? In any genre, it could be classical music, it could be black metal or whatever, uh, because you're looking for different things. You might be looking for energy, you might be looking for paradoxes, or for friction, or for release, or tension and release, and so forth. Um, would the immediate well, the language around using scents is very often oriented towards pleasantness,
Yes.
and the positive hedonic notes. Although in performative contexts, and in for instance some contemporary art, it's not necessarily pleasant, but it is not sort of framed as the scent. Often the scent is not framed as sort of a significant part of the artwork. Uh, what's your experience in administering semi-pleasant or unpleasant scents to an audience? Because we have also experimented with that,
Mm-hmm.
like we tested manure or
Mm-hmm.
tar and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, what's your thinking about that in as a parallel between smelling and hearing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because it should be mentioned that most people only think about smells when it's a pleasant smell or when it's an unpleasant smell, and literally they're like, oh, if that's a pleasant smell, then no, that's nice, and then they move forward. If it's an unpleasant smell, it's like, okay, remove the source of the smell or remove myself from that source and just go about my day. Most people's awareness of the olfactory world is limited to that. So I feel a little bit of a responsibility as an artist that has worked with scent since the late 1990s to meet people where they're at. A lot of my work in non-performance venues, let's say within the context of a museum, within the context of social practice, will use unpleasant smells, but I'll use them in very specific ways that are allied with creating conversation. A lot of my work is relational in the sense that people will experience smells, scentscapes in time and have the opportunity to talk about them under the kind of auspices of whatever I set for the nature of the project. With performance, where you've got a captive audience, they're sitting, they're having a shared experience. Oftentimes, they've paid admission. I'm much more interested in creating. I'm going to call it a conventional set of conventional aesthetics, in the sense that I would love to hear from the audience that, wow, I'm familiar with each of those notes that you used, but together you transcended the sum of their parts. And I like that idea that for a period of time we can produce something beautiful, which is why I really really wanted to work with Preston for a long time, was that I've been a fan of what he's done over the years, and I thought that it just really naturally worked with this PS kind of concept.
Yeah, I like hearing that. I was curious about that myself, Eric. That's a good question because I'm coming from outside the scent art world. I've learned pretty much what I know from Brian, who's a great source. But since this was my first foray into it, I did I did know that I was using some scents, especially in the fourth movement, the last movement, that I wanted to be a little more earthy, animalistic, musky. I don't have the expertise to know how that would play out or what specifically could be unpleasant, but I knew that they weren't just perfumey, pleasant, flowery things. And so it was really great to learn as I brought the score to Brian and we went over the scents together to hear his response and his enthusiasm for using them. He never pushed back and said, no, that smells like ass, I don't want to use it. He said, that smells like ass, great, let's figure out like what that means in terms of the four scents that it's sitting with and how to use it in the way that serves the piece. And so that would be my take or even my advice for scent artists if they want to start experimenting with unpleasant or semi-pleasant scents, is it's never a good idea to do it for the sake of doing it, just to transgress. I think we've already seen all that. We're kind of in a post-transgressive space probably in art. I know people will always try to do it, and that's fine. I find that really less interesting, or maybe something you do when you're developing. But I think in terms of a mature work of art, if it's necessary or if it serves the piece, you should be courageous to use it in an artful way, but not just for the sake of it, if that makes sense. And I think that's how those scents were incorporated in our piece. To me, they really had a logic in terms of I wanted each movement to have its own feel and there to be a progression. And that's why I think it worked. And I would be interested to experiment with that more, to see what other kinds of scents outside the pleasant perfumey region can be worked with in a really interesting, provocative way.
To me, your answers make much sense, and it's important what you say, Brian, that the audience is captive in the room. A person might be sitting in the middle of a row, and you don't want to force that person to leave the room and create those kinds of situations.
Yeah.
If you're creating installations that we saw a lot about in Riga, I think that's a very different situation because it's much more voluntary. You can open the lid of a container, and it could be really unpleasant, and you can just close the lid and leave the room, which is a different situation, I think. Although it might be interesting to, I was thinking whether your Odophonics could be transformed into, let's say, a 4-piece installation with the headsets and scents, something like that, or either sound and picture, which would then maybe allow you, Brian, to be more transgressive in case of scents. If you felt that it was needed, as you say, Preston, I completely agree with you that that the provocations exists elsewhere than those kinds of transgressions in art today. Yes.
Yeah.
You know what's funny, Erik, is that it didn't register until you just mentioned black metal that you're from Norway, where it's sort of like the black metal is hailed there. And so I started to think after you asked that question how there are a subset of people who appreciate the antagonism and the discipline required to sit through something that other people would feel would be transgressive or a burden or persecution or something, because they arrive at something and limits are tested and perceptual limits are tested. And so it makes me think that this could be a completely different project, maybe outside of the scope of Odophonics, but being able to do the equivalent of the olfactory equivalent of a black metal concert where
Or a
you're
horror movie.
releasing something. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's lots of potential there.
for
Yeah,
sure.
horror movies. We have used horror movies for those kind of purposes for a long time, also, right?
Really.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You're watching a horror movie, and you're scared shitless, and you do it voluntarily, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a space there for sure. Yeah. I like the idea of olfactory black metal. I think you just hit on something. Please do it.
Ding.
Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, maybe we should wrap this up.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I
Enjoyed
really
the
appreciate you
conversation.
both for.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much for having me.